So transitioning over to provision 4, and again, these are just some thoughts that I have that are ways in which Fowler has helped me to think about my own discipline. And again, one of the things that we're trying to do a lot of intentionally in this course is to do some faith integration. How do we, at Azusa Pacific University, it may include students, it may not include students. If students don't come from a faith perspective, I want them to kind of appreciate the task that we're about, but I don't expect students to process all of these questions the same way I do. But we are intentional at Azusa Pacific on faith integration. What does that look like? How are we trying to do it in this course? And by we, I mean the faculty, whether nursing faculty or theology faculty, trying to integrate these ideas. So Fowler, page 59. Toward the bottom, makes this statement: accountability and responsibility are always linked to standards, as there must be something against which one's decisions or actions can be measured or must be measured. And that statement makes me think actually of the law. So if one is held accountable to something, and by law here, I'm talking about the Hebrew Bible, I'm talking about the Old Testament law. If there is something against which someone is held accountable, that is a code in some way. It's it may be a written code, it may be an oral code, but there is something that determines whether behavior is indeed good or bad behavior. Going back to Isaiah in chapter 5 verse 20, Isaiah says, woe to those who call evil good and good evil. So woe to those who take the standard and twist it all around for their own ends, for their own desires. That is not something that is acceptable in a religious context. It's not something that's acceptable in a nursing context, in a legal context. But when I read that in Fowler, I thought, here's another place where our conversation is much the same. So even if we reduce the law down to 2, which is what Jesus does in Luke chapter 10, we talked about that last week, there still must be some standard of measure. If the standard is loving the Lord your God with everything in you and loving your neighbor as yourself, then that accountability and responsibility as for me, speaking for me, right, as someone who says, yes, this is my text, this is my book, this is the standard by which I think I need to live my life, I'm accountable to that, to loving God and to loving my neighbor. And of course then the conversation that Jesus entered into with the lawyer last week, who is my neighbor? We don't need to revisit that. But I think that was a way in which it was helpful for me to think about accountability and responsibility. It's not just that there is the standard, but I am in some way involved in that. I'm in some way linked to that. Well, what does that mean? So on page 62, the next piece of the puzzle that I want to draw attention to, there's this large paragraph in the middle of the page that talks about accountability, responsibility, and authority to act. All too often, and with I think some of the case studies that we see at the end of this chapter, this Provision 4 chapter, there are ever so many places where in life we find both accountability and responsibility and no authority, or we find just accountability or responsibility and no authority. But it seems to me, and this is something, it's also linked with independent practice here in the nursing standard. This is something I think that is helpful for me to think about when I do my work, that I should have some kind of accountability and responsibility and authority to act. If I don't have authority to act, then we get into that whole conversation that we had a couple of weeks ago about what it is to be a collaborator and what it means to be a cooperator, right? Is collaboration the goal or is cooperation the goal? And one, I interpret it as being more directed. You must cooperate with me. I'm setting the agenda. Collaboration is we determine the agenda together. On page 64, there is Reiser's warning about, and I thought this was really helpful in this standard, the over-reliance on technology, and specifically as it dealt with assessing patient care. Now I'm going to take that and take it in my own direction. Obviously, we're doing an online component to a face-to-face course, or we're doing the completely online course, you and I together, right? And so there are things that we can do technologically, but there are certain limits to that. Are there as many limits as I thought there were? Well, probably not. There are more things that we can do than I thought we could do, 20 years ago. But at the same time, the ability for us to be in relationship is limited in this kind of format. And I thought about my own life. I thought about tests that I have experienced, medical tests, and the idea of whether I, as the patient, would be listened to. This is really a helpful kind of conversation for me, because I'm interested from a theological perspective in the essential question of what it means to be human, right? So in Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27, the writer says that we're going to make humankind in our image. I've got a friend, I think I told you before, forgive me if I'm repeating myself, that instead of calling him Adam and calling her Eve, he calls them the dirtlings, because the word Adam is rooted in the word for ground or dirt. So I think that's kind of funny. So got these dirtlings, right, that God creates. And the essential question is, what does it mean to be created in God's image? Now, there are two things going on. Number one, collectively as humankind, we're God's image. And then individually, that's translated out in the Hebrew Bible as well. So what is the impact of technology? Does technology humanize, or does it dehumanize? Does it dehumanize on its own? Or is it our approach to technology that dehumanizes? What does it mean to be human, and then to preserve that humanity in the use of technology? I think those of us that are involved in this kind of religious study, this religious dimension, I think that's probably, the idea of dignity and humanity. We deal with people face to face very often, but it's easy to slide into a use of technology that can be dehumanizing. How our churches maybe, or synagogues or mosques or gurdwaras, right? How are they dehumanizing people through the use of technology? Are we doing that too? And I had really been thinking about that in terms of, nursing practice, or in terms of healthcare practice. But this question now resides in me a little bit more. And if my goal is to not only recognize the dignity and worth of other human beings, as we talked about in a previous talk, how am I accountable as a part of this team, whatever this team is that I'm a part of? How am I accountable for enhancing the dignity of the human person? The Fowler text helps me think about that. We can go on and talk about some things on page 65. Crucial element of evidence-informed practice: nurses should trust their well-informed judgment. So that is human to human, and then advocate for the patient, sometimes with other members of the team that may want to rely more on the technology. Page 66, laws do not direct or control nursing ethics or morals. Page 67 touches on the idea of personal values conflicting with the law. These are challenges that you face on a daily basis, and you have my utmost respect. Hopefully this talk has helped you think through some of those things a little bit, at least from my perspective. Maybe it helps.